Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time. Chapter 25. Calvin's Appeal to Francis I. Enthusiasm evoked by the appearance of the Institutes. Marshals the Reformed into one host. Beauty of the style of the Institutes. Opinions expressed on it by Scaliger. Sir William Hamilton. Principal Cunningham. M. Naird. The Institutes an apology for the Reformed. In scathing indignation comparable to Tacitus. Rome thrusts. He addresses the King of France, pleads for his brethren. They suffer for the gospel, cannot abandon it, offer themselves to death. A warning. Grandeur of the appeal. Did Francis ever read this appeal? Thus did a strong arm uplift before the eyes of all Europe, and throw loose upon the winds a banner round which the children of the Reformation might rally. Its appearance at that hour greatly inspired them. It showed them that they had a righteous cause, an energetic and courageous leader, and that they were no longer a mere multitude, but a marshaled host, whose appointed march was over a terrible battlefield, but to whom there was also appointed a triumph worthy of their cause and of the kingly spirit who had arisen to lead them, spreading, says Felice, widely in the schools, in the castles of the gentry, the homes of the citizens, and the workshops of the common people. The Institutes became the most powerful of preachers. The style of the work was not less fitted to arrest attention than the contents. It seemed as if produced for the occasion. Inflexibility, transparency, and power. It was akin to the beauty of the truths that were entrusted to it, and of which it was made the vehicle. Yet Calvin had not thought of style. The great doctrines he was enunciating engrossed him entirely, and the free and majestic march of his thoughts summoned up the words of fitting simplicity and grandeur, and without conscious effort on his part, marshaled them in a most effective order, and arranged them in the most harmonious periods. In giving France a religion, Calvin at the same time gave France a language. Men who have had but little sympathy with this theology have been loud in their praises of his genius. Scaliger said of him, 300 years ago, "Calvin is alone among theologians. There is no ancient to compare with him." Sir William Hamilton in our own day has endorsed this judgment. Looking merely to his learning and ability, said this distinguished metaphysician, Calvin was superior to all modern, perhaps to all ancient, divines. Succeeding ages have certainly not exhibited his equal. Dr. Cunningham, a most competent judge, says, "The Institutes of Calvin is the most important work in the history of theological science. It may be said to occupy, in the science of theology, the place which it requires both the Novum Organum of Bacon and the Principia of Newton to fill up in physical science." Less learned, says Paul Lacroix of his style, elaborate, more ornate than that of Rabelais, but more ready, flexible, and skillful in expressing all the shades of thought and feeling, less ingenious, agreeable, and rich than that of Amiot, but keener and more imposing, less highly colored and engaging than that of Montaigne, but more concise and serious, and more French. Another French writer of our day, who does not belong to the Protestant Church, but who is a profound thinker, has characterized the Institutes as the first work in the French tongue, which offers a methodical plan, well-arranged matter, and exact composition. Calvin, he says, not only perfected the language by enriching it, he created a peculiar form of language, the most conformable to the genius of our country. And of Calvin himself, he says, he treats every question of Christian philosophy as a great writer. He equals the most sublime in his grand thoughts upon God, the expression of which was equaled but not surpassed by Bossuet. A scheme of doctrine, a code of government, a plan of church organization. The Institutes was at the same time an apology, a defense of the persecuted, and an appeal to the conscience of the persecutor. It was dedicated to Francis I, but the dedication did not run in the usual form. Calvin did not approach the monarch to bow and glaze, to recount his virtues and extol his greatness. He spoke as it becomes one to speak who pleads for the innocent condemned at unrighteous tribunals, and for truth overborne by bloody violence. His dedication was a noble, most affecting and thrilling intercession for his brethren in France, many of whom were at that moment languishing in prison or perishing at the stake. With a nobler indignation than even that which burns on the pages of Tacitus, and in a style scarcely inferior in its rapid and scathing power to that of the renowned historian, does Calvin proceed to refute, rapidly yet conclusively, the leading charges which had been advanced against the disciples of the Reformation, and to denounce the terrible array of banishments, proscriptions, fines, dungeons, torturing, and blazing piles with which it was sought to root them out. Your doctrine is new, it was said. Yes, Calvin makes the answer, for those to whom the gospel is new. By what miracle do you confirm it? It had been asked. Calvin, glancing contemptuously at the sort of miracles which the priests sometimes employed to confirm the Romish doctrine, replies, by those miracles which in the early age so abundantly attested the divinity of the gospel, the holy lives of its disciples. You contradict the fathers, it had been further urged. The reformer twits his accuser with adoring the slips and errors of the fathers, but when they speak well, they either do not hear, or they misinterpret or corrupt what they say. That is a very extraordinary way of showing respect to the fathers. Despise the fathers. Why, the fathers are our best friends. He was a father. Epiphanius, who said that it was an abomination to set up an image in a Christian temple. He was a father. Pope Gelasius, who maintained that the bread and wine remain unchanged in the Eucharist. He was a father. Augustine, who affirmed that it was rash to assert any doctrine which did not rest on the clear testimony of Scripture. But the fathers come faster than Calvin can receive their evidence, and so a crowd of names are thrown into the margin, all who with one heart and with one mouth execrated and condemned the sophistical reasoning and scholastic wrangling with which the Word of God had been made void. Turning round on his accusers and waxing a little warm, Calvin demands who they are who make war with such savage cruelty in behalf of the Mass, of purgatory, of pilgrimages, and of similar follies, and why is it they display zeal in behalf of these things which they have never shown for the gospel? Why, he replies, but because their God is their belly, and their religion the kitchen, a rejoinder of which it is easier to condemn the coarseness than to impugn the truth. If their cause were unjust, or if their lives had been wicked, they refuse not to die. But the reformer complains that the most atrocious calumnies had been poured into the ears of the king to make their tenets appear odious and their persons hateful. They plotted, it was said, to pluck the scepter from his hand, to overturn his tribunals, to abolish all laws, to make a spoil of lordships and heritages, to remove all the landmarks of order, and to plunge all people and all states into war, anarchy, and ruin. Had the accusation been true, Calvin would have been dumb. He would have been covered with shame and confusion before the king. But raising his head, he says, "I turn to you, sire. Is it possible that we, from whom a seditious word was never heard when we lived under you, should plot the subversion of kingdoms? And what is more, who now, after being expelled from our houses, cease not to nevertheless pray to God for your prosperity and that of your kingdom. As regards their cause, so defamed by enemies, it was simply the gospel of Jesus Christ. Their only crime was that they believed the gospel. They who were maintaining it were a poor, despicable people, nay, if the king liked it, the scum of the earth. But though its confessors were weak, the cause was great. It is exalted far above all the powers and glory of the world, for it is not ours, but that of the living God and his Christ, whom God has made king to rule from sea to sea, and from the rivers unto the ends of the earth. He had not come before the king to beg toleration for that cause. The men of those days could no more conceive of a government tolerating two opposing religions than of a judge deciding in favor of two rival claimants. What Calvin demanded was that their cause should receive that submission which is the right of truth, and that the king should embrace, not tolerate. But if this may not be, Calvin says in effect, if injustice shall still be meted out to us, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not abandon the truth, or bow down to the gods that Rome has set up, as sheep appointed unto the slaughter. We shall take meekly whatever sufferings you are pleased to inflict upon us. We offer our persons to your prisons, our limbs to your racks, our necks to your axes, and our bodies to your fires. We know that there is one in whose sight our blood is precious, and in shedding it, you are removing the firmest defenders of your throne and of your laws, and preparing your house and realm a terrible overthrow. The years will quickly revolve. The cup will be filled up, and then... But let us quote the very words in which the young reformer closes this appeal to the great monarch. I have set before you the iniquity of our fiercest detractors. I have desired to soften your heart to the end that you would give our cause a hearing. I hope we shall be able to regain your favor, if you should be pleased to read without anger this confession, which is our defense before your majesty. But if malevolent persons stop your ears, if the accused have not an opportunity of defending themselves, if impetuous furies, unrestrained by your orders, still exercise their cruelty by imprisonments and by scourging, by tortures, mutilation, and the stake, verily, as sheep given up to the slaughter, we shall be reduced to the last extremity. Yet even then, we shall possess our souls in patience, and shall wait for the strong hand of our Lord. Doubtless it will be stretched forth in due season. It will appear armed to deliver the poor from their afflictions, and to punish the despisers who are now making merry so boldly. May my Lord, the King of Kings, establish your throne in righteousness and your seat in equity." In penning this appeal, Calvin occupied one of the most sublime positions in all history. He stood at a great bar, the throne of France. He pleaded before a vast assembly, all Christendom, nay, all ages, and as regards the cause which he sustained at this august bar, and in the presence of this immense concourse of nations and ages, it was the greatest in the world, inasmuch as it was that of the gospel and of the rights of conscience. With what feelings, one naturally asks, did Francis I read this appeal? Or rather, did he read it at all? It is commonly thought that he did not. His heart hardened by pleasure, and his ears preoccupied with evil counselors, this cry of a suffering church could find no audience. It swept past the throne of France, and mounted to the throne of heaven. But before the strong arm to which Calvin had alluded should be stretched forth, more than 2 centuries were to pass away. These martyrs had to wait till their brethren also should be slain as they had been. But meanwhile there were given unto them the white robes of this triumphant vindication, for scarcely were their ashes cold when this eloquent and touching appeal was pleading for them in many of the tongues of Europe, thrilling every heart with the story of their wrongs, and inspiring thousands and tens of thousands to brave the tyrant's fury, and at the risk of torture and death to confess the gospel. This was their first resurrection. What they had sown in weakness at the stake rose in power in the institutes. Calvin, gathering as it were all their martyr piles into one blazing torch, and holding it aloft, made the splendor of their cause and of their names to shine from the east even unto the west of Christendom. The publication of the Institutes placed Calvin in the van of the reformed hosts. He was henceforward recognized chief of the Reformation. His retreat was now known, and the city on the edge of the Black Forest, on the banks of the Rhine, could no longer afford him the privacy he sought. Men from every country were beginning to seek him out and gather round him. Rising up, he hastily quitted Basel, and crossing Italy's snowy wall, by what route is not known, and holding on his way across the plain of Lombardy till he reached the banks of the Po, he found an asylum at the court of Renée, daughter of Louis XII of France, and Duchess of Ferrara, who, like Margaret of Valois, had opened her heart to the doctrines of the Reformation. Calvin disappears for a while from the scene. Book 14. Rise and Establishment of Protestantism at Geneva. Chapter 1. Geneva, the city and its history. Protestantism finds a new center, the Lake Leman. Geneva, its site, its diminutive size, sneers. History of Geneva. 4 names: Julius Caesar, Honorius, Charlemagne. The Reformation indicate the 4 stages of its history. The bishop its first ruler. Intrigues of the Dukes of Savoy. Pope Martin V takes from the Genevese the right of electing their bishop. Exercises it himself. Appoints a Prince of Savoy to be Bishop of Geneva. Its independence on the point of being extinguished. New life. War between the Prince-Bishop and the citizens. Bonnivard. His picture of the popes. Berthelier. His devotion to his country. Lévrier. His love of justice. The war then and now. wonderful preservation of Geneva's independence, a higher liberty approaching. It was time that Protestantism complete its logical and doctrinal development before returning to the open stage of the great empires of France and Germany and resuming our narrative of the renovating powers which the Reformation had called forth. With the great social and political revolutions which came in its train, we must devote our attention to a city that is about to become the second metropolis of Protestantism. In leaving the wide arena of empire where Protestantism is jostled by dukes, prelates, and emperors, and moves amid the blaze of state pageantries, and in shifting ourselves up in a little town whose name history as yet had hardly deigned to mention, and whose diminutive size is all but annihilated by the mighty mountainous masses amid which it is placed, we make a great transition. But if the stage is narrow, and if Protestantism is stripped of all that drapery and pomp which make it so imposing on the wider arena, we shall here have a closer view of the principle itself, and be the better able to mark its sublimity and power, in the mighty impulses which, from this center, it is to shed abroad, in order to plant piety and nourish liberty in other countries. In the valley, which the Jura on one side, and the White Alps on the other, enclose within their gigantic arms, lies the mirror-like Leman. At the point where the Rhone gushes from the lake, a bulging rock bristles up, and running in the form of a crescent, a little space along the shore of the Leman, forms a pedestal for the city of Geneva. The little town looks down upon the placid waters of the lake spread out at its feet, and beholds its own image, mirrored clearly, but not grandly, for architectural magnificence is not one of the characteristic features of the city, especially in the times of which we write. A few miles away on the other side, another rock shoots up, dark, precipitous, and attaining the dignity of a mountain. Lofty it would seem in any other country, but here it has to compete with the gigantic piles of the Alps, and bending crest-like leans over Geneva, which it appears to guard. A few acres suffice to give standing room to the city. Its population in the days of Calvin numbered only some 12,000, and even now does it not much exceed 70,000. Its cantonal territory is the smallest in all Switzerland, that of Zug excepted. Its diminutive size provoked the sneer of the philosopher of Ferney, who could survey it all standing at his door. "When I dress my peruke," said Voltaire, "I powder the whole republic." The Emperor Paul sarcastically called the struggles of its citizens a tempest in a teapot. In the days prior to the utterance of these sarcasms and taunts, that is, in the latter part of the 16th century, this little town excited other emotions than those of contempt, and was the butt of other assaults than those of sarcasm. It brought pallor to the face of monarchs. It plucked the scepter from the grasp of mighty empires, and showed the world that it knew how to extend and perpetuate its sway by making itself the metropolis of that moral and spiritual movement which, whatever might be the fate of the city itself, even should its site become the bare rock it once was, would continue to spread abroad to all countries and travel down to all the ages of the future. Turning from its site to its history, Geneva dates from before the Christian era, and is scarcely, if at all, less ancient than that other city that takes the proud name of Eternal, and with which it has been Geneva's lot in these last ages to do battle buried amid the dense shadows of paganism, and afterwards amid the not less dense shadows of popery. Geneva remained for ages unknown, and gave no portent to the world of the important part which it was destined to play, at a most eventful epoch in the history of nations. It comes first into view in connection with the great Julius, who stumbled upon it as he was pursuing his career of northern conquest, and wrote its name in his commentaries, where it figures as the last fortress of the Allobroges. But the conqueror passed, and with him passed the light, which had touched for a moment this subalpine stronghold. It fell back again into the darkness. Under Honorius, in the 4th century, it became a city. It rose to some eminence, and even was possessed of a little liberty in the days of Charlemagne. But a better day spring awaited Geneva. The rising sun of the Reformation struck full upon it, and this small town became one of the lights of the world. But we must glance back and see what a long preparation the little city had to undergo for its great destiny. The dissolution of the empire of Charlemagne set Geneva free to consider after what fashion it should govern itself. At this crisis, its bishop stepped forward and claimed, in addition to its spiritual oversight, the right to exercise its temporal government. The citizens conceded the claim only within certain limits, still preserving their liberties. They took the bishop into partnership with them in the civic jurisdiction. The election of the bishop was in the hands of the people, and before permitting him to mount the episcopal chair, they made him take an oath to preserve their franchises. In the middle of the 13th century, the independence of Geneva began to be menaced by the Counts of Savoy. That ambitious house, which was laboring to exalt itself by absorbing its neighbors' territory into its own, had cast covetous eyes upon Geneva. It would round off their dominions. Besides, they were sharp-sighted enough to see that there were certain principles at work in the little Alpine town which made them uneasy. But neither intrigues nor arms, and the princes of Savoy employed both, could prevail to this end. The citizens of Geneva knew how it fared with them under the staff of their bishop, but they did not know how it might go with them under the sword of the warrior, and so they stubbornly declined the protection of their powerful neighbor. In the 15th century, the Counts of Savoy, now become dukes, still persevering in their attempts to bring the brave little city under their yoke, besought the aid of a power which history attests has done more than all the dukes and warriors of Christendom to extinguish liberty. Duke Amadeus VIII, who had added Piedmont to his hereditary dominions, as if to exemplify the adage that ambition grows by what it feeds on, petitioned Pope Martin V to vest in him the secular lordship of Geneva. The citizens scented what was in the wind, and knowing that Rome ought not to lay its paw upon kingdoms, resolved to brave the Pope himself if need were. Laying their hands upon the Gospels, they exclaimed, "No alienation of the city or of its territory, this we swear." Amadeus withdrew before the firm attitude of the Genevese. Not so the Pope. He continued to prosecute the intrigue, deeming the little town but a nest of eaglets among crags, which it were wise betimes to pull down. But, more crafty than the Duke, he tried another tactic, depriving the citizens of the right of electing their bishop. Martin V took the nomination into his own hands, and thus opened the way for quietly transferring the municipal rule of Geneva to the House of Savoy. All he had now to do was appoint a Prince of Savoy as its bishop. By and by this was done, and the struggle with Savoy power was no longer outside the walls only. It was mainly within. The era that now opened to Geneva was a stormy and bloody one. Intrigues and rumors of intrigues kept the citizens in perpetual disquiet. The city saw itself stripped of its privileges and immunities one by one. Its annual fair was transferred to Lyon, and the crowd of merchants and traders which had flocked to it from beyond the Alps, from the towns of France, and from across the Rhine, ceased to be seen. Tales of priestly scandals, for the union of the two offices in their prince-bishop only helped to develop the worst qualities of both, passed from mouth to mouth and polluted the very air. If Geneva was growing weaker, Savoy was growing stronger. The absorption of one petty principality after another was daily enlarging the dominions of the Duke, which, sweeping past and around Geneva, enclosed it as in a net. With a hostile land bristling with castles and swarming with foes, it was said that there were more Savoyans than Genevese who heard the bells of Saint Pierre. Such was the position in which the opening of the 16th century found Geneva. This small but ancient municipality was seemingly on the point of being absorbed in the dominions of the House of Savoy. Its history appeared to be closed. The vulture of the Alps, which had hovered above it for centuries, had but to swoop down upon it and transfix it with his talons. At that moment a new life suddenly sprang up in the devoted city. To preserve the remnant of their franchises was not enough. The citizens resolved to recover what liberties had been lost. In order to do this, many battles had to be fought, and much blood spilt. Leo X, about the same time that he dispatched Tetzel to Germany to sell indulgences, sent a scion of the House of Savoy to Geneva, 1513, as bishop. By the first pope drew forth Luther from his convent. By the second he paved the way for Calvin. The newly appointed bishop, known in history as the Bastard of Savoy, brought to the episcopal throne of Geneva a body foul with disease, the fruit of his debaucheries, and a soul yet more foul with deceitful and bloody passions, but a fit tool for the purpose in hand. The matter had been nicely arranged between the Pope, the Duke, and the Bastard. John of Savoy swore to hand over the temporal jurisdiction of the city to the Duke, but the Pope swore he would force the city to submit to the Duke, under pain of incurring the thunders of the Vatican. From that time there was ceaseless and bitter war between the citizens of Geneva on the one side and the Duke and the Bishop on the other. It is not our business to record the various fortunes of that strife. Now it was the bishop who was besieged in his palace, and now it was the citizens who were butchered upon their own streets by the bishop's soldiers. Today it was the bastard who was compelled to seek safety in flight, and tomorrow it was some leader of the patriots who was apprehended, tortured, beheaded, and his ghastly remains hung up to the public gaze as a warning to others. But if blood was shed, it was blood that leads to victory. The patriots, who numbered only 9 at first, multiplied from year to year, though from year to year the struggle grew only the bloodier. The gospel had not yet entered the gates of Geneva. The struggle so far was for liberty only, a name then denoting that which was man's noblest birthright after the gospel, and which found as its champions men of pure and lofty soul. Wittenberg and Geneva had not yet become fused. The two liberties had not yet united their arms. Among the nations that illustrate this struggle, so important from what was to come after, are the well-known ones of Bonivard, Berthelier, and Lévrier, a distinguished trio to whom modern liberty owes much, though the stage on which they figured was a narrow one. Bonivard was a son of the Renaissance, a scholar and a man of wit. He drew his inspiration for liberty from a classic font. From his priory of St. Victor, this accomplished and liberal-minded man assailed Rome with the shafts of satire. If his intellect was less profound, and his taste less exquisite than that of Erasmus, his courage was greater. The scholar of Rotterdam flagellated the man in serge, but spared the man in purple. The prior of St. Victor dealt equal justice to monk and pope. He lashed the ignorance of low vices of the former, but castigated yet more severely the pride, luxury, and ambition of the latter. He mistrusted the plan Rome had hit on of regenerating men in tribes and clans, and preferred to have it done individually. He thought, too, that it would be well if His Holiness possessed a little holiness, though that was a marvel he did not expect soon to see. I have lived, he said, to see 3 popes, first Alexander VI, Borgia, a sharp fellow, a ne'er-do-well, a man without conscience and without God. Next came Julius II, proud, choleric, studying his bottle more than his breviary, mad about his popedom, and having no thought but how he could subdue not only the earth, but heaven and hell. Lastly appeared Leo X, the present pope, learned in Greek and Latin, but especially a good musician, a great glutton, a deep drinker, possessing beautiful pages, whom the Italians styled ragazzi. Above all, don't trust Leo X's word. He can dispense others, and surely can dispense himself. He brusquely allegorized the German Reformation thus: Leo X and his predecessors, said the prior, have always taken the Germans for beasts. Pecora campi, they were called, and rightly too, for these simple Saxons allowed themselves to be saddled and ridden like asses. The popes threatened them with cudgeling, excommunications, enticed them with thistles, indulgences, and so made them trot to the mill to bring away the meal for them. But, having one day loaded the ass too heavily, Leo made him jib, so that the flour was split, and the white bread lost. That ass is called Martin, like all asses, and his surname is Luther, which signifies enlightener. The lettered and gentlemanly prior of St. Victor had not a little of the cold, sneering, skeptical spirit that belonged to the Renaissance. He put on his gloves when he came in contact with the citizens of Geneva. They were somewhat too bluff and outspoken for him. Nevertheless, he continued steadfastly on their side, and, with not a few temptations to act a contrary part, proved himself a true friend of liberty. He was seized with the idea that were he Bishop and Prince of Geneva, he would have it in his power to liberate his native city. He even set off to Rome in the hope of realizing a project which everyone who knew who Bonaparte was, and what Rome was, must have deemed chimerical. It was found at Rome that he had not the grace for a bishop, and he returned without the mitre. It was a wonder to many that he was permitted to return at all, and the prior must have been thankful for his escape. Berthelier was cast in another mold. He was the tribune of the people. He talked, laughed, and caroused with them. He sought especially to surround himself with the youth of Geneva. For this end he studied their tastes, and entered into all their amusements. But all the while he was on the watch for fitting occasions of firing them with his own spirit of hatred of tyranny and devotion to the public welfare. He was sagacious, ready, indomitable, and careless of life. He knew what the struggle was coming to as regarded himself, but he did not bemoan the hard fate awaiting him, knowing that there was a mysterious and potent power in blood to advance the cause for which it was shed. The third of the group, individually so unlike, yet at one in the cause of their country's ancient freedom, was Lévrier. He was calm, severe, and logical. His ideal was justice. He was a judge, and whatever was not according to law ought to be resisted and overthrown. The bishop's regime was one continuous perversion of right. It must be brought to an end. So pleaded Leverrier. From time immemorial the men of Geneva had been free. What right did the Duke of Savoy and his creature, the bishop, to make slaves of them? Neither the Duke nor the bishop was sovereign in Geneva. Its true ruler was its charter of ancient franchises. So said the man of law. The Duke feared the great citizen. Leverrier was quiet but firm. He indulged in no clamor, but he cherished no fear. He bowed before the majesty of law and stood erect before the tyrant. Han voltus instantis tyranni, mente quatit solida. Such were the men who are now fighting the battle of liberty at the foot of the Alps, in the dawn of modern times. That battle has varied its form in the course of the centuries. In later, the contest in continental Europe has been to separate the spiritual from the temporal, relegate each to its own proper domain, and establish between the two such a poise as shall form a safeguard to freedom, and especially to pluck the sword of the state from the hands of the ecclesiastical power. But at Geneva, in the times we write of, the conflict had for its immediate object to prevent a separation between the two powers. Nevertheless, the battle is the same in both cases, the same Geneva 300 years ago as in Europe in 1875. The Genevans had no love for the man who occupied their episcopal throne. It was no aim of theirs, in the last resort, to preserve a class of amphibious rulers, neither prince nor bishop, but to the two mixed and confounded, to the immense detriment of both. The Prince Bishop of Geneva was, on a small scale, what the Prince Bishop of Rome was, on a great. But the Genevans preferred having one tyrant to having two. This was the alternative before them. They knew that should they at this hour strip the bishop of the temporal government, the Duke would seize upon it, and they preferred themselves meanwhile keeping the mitre and the sceptre united, in the hope that they would thus not only shut out the Duke, but eventually expel the Prince Bishop. Marvelous it truly was that so little a city should escape so many snares, and defy so many armed assaults, for the Duke again and again advanced with his army to take it. Nay, upon one occasion was admitted within its walls. There were foes enough around it, one would have thought, to have swept it from off its rock, and buried it beneath the waves of its lake. And so would it have happened to Geneva, but for the bravery of its sons, who were resolved that sooner than see it enslaved, they would see it razed to the ground. Had it been a great empire, its posts, dignities, and titles might have stimulated and sustained their patriotism. But what recompense in point of fame or riches could a little obscure town like Geneva offer for the blood which its citizen heroes were ready at every moment to pour out in defense of its freedom? A higher power than man had kindled this fire in the hearts of its citizens. The combatants were fighting, although they knew it not, for a higher liberty than Geneva had yet tasted, and that liberty was on the road to it. The snowy peaks around it were now beginning to kindle with a new day. Voices were heard crying to the beleaguered and perplexed town, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of them that bring good tidings, that publish peace!" It was the purpose of him who putteth down the mighty from their seats, and exalteth the lowly, to lift this city to equality with the ancient capitals of Christendom, nay, to place it above them all. For this end would he make empty the episcopal throne in St. Pierre, that the gospel might enter and seat itself upon it. Then would Geneva raise its head in the presence of the ancient and historic cities of Europe, Rome, Paris, Milan, and Venice, with a halo around it brighter than had ever encircled their brow. It would stand forth a temple of liberty in the midst of Christendom, its gates open day and night to welcome within its walls, as within an impregnable fortress, the persecuted of all lands. Chapter 2. Geneva's Martyrs of Liberty. Berthelier, apprehended, beheaded. His remains publicly exposed. Bonivard, banished. Castle of Quillan, Bishop of Geneva dies. His remorse. Levrier, his attest by the Duke, carried to the castle of Bonn. His execution. What victories of brute force lead to. Momentary triumph of the Duke. He flees from Geneva, never to return. Lessons learned by Genevese exiles. They return to act them out. Geneva's gates open towards the rising sun. Before the day of Geneva's greatness should have arrived, many of its heroic defenders would be resting in the grave. The road there for nearly all of them being by the scaffold. Let us recount the fate of the more prominent, and first of all, of Berthelier. One morning, as he was going to breathe the fresh air outside the walls of his favorite meadow, bathed by the waters of the Rhone, he was arrested by the Duke's soldiers. He bore himself with calmness and dignity at his arrest, and during the few days now left him of life, he wrote on the walls of his prison a verse of Scripture, which permits us to hope that he had cast anchor in another world than that which he was so soon to leave. His head fell by the hand of the executioner at the foot of Caesar's Tower in the Isle on the Leman, near the point where the road issues from the lake. His fellow citizens beheld him die, but could not save him. The cruel deed but deepened their purpose of vengeance. The head of the patriot was fastened upon the bridge of the Arve. Blackening in the sun, it was a ghastly memorial of a saviour tyranny, and a thrilling appeal to the compatriots of Berthelier never to submit to the despot who had no other rewards than this for the noblest of Geneva's sons. The fate of Bonivard was less tragic, but has become better known to us from the notice bestowed upon him by a great poet. He was deprived of his priory, and while a scaffold was set up Berthelier at one extremity of the Leman, a dungeon was found for Bonivard at the other. The modern tourist, as he passes along the lovely shores of the lake, beneath the magnificent amphitheater of mountains that overhang Vevey, has his attention arrested by the massive and still entire walls of a castle, surrounded on all sides by the deep waters of the Leman, save where the drawbridge joins it to the shore. This is the castle of Quillan, the scene of Bonivard's imprisonment, and where the track worn by his feet in the rocky floor may still be traced, while the ripple of the water, which rises to the level of the loophole in the wall, may be heard when the wind stirs upon the lake. At this stage of the drama, the wretched man who had filled the office of bishop and had been the Duke's co-conspirator in these attempts upon the liberty of Geneva, died, 1522, miserably at Pignerol, on the southern side of the Alps, on the very frontier of the territory of the Waldenses. His dying scene was awful and horrible. Around his bed stood only hirelings. Careless of the agonies he was enduring, their eyes roamed round the room in quest of valuables which they might carry off whenever his breath should depart. The effigies of his victims seemed traced upon the walls of his chamber. They presented to him a crucifix. He thought that it was Berthelier and shrieked out. They brought him the last sacrament. He fancied that they were sprinkling him with blood. His lips whitened with foam. let fall execrations and blasphemies, such as the picture which a Romanist writer draws of his last hours. But before the dark scene closed, something like a ray of light broke in. He conjured his coadjutor and successor, Pierre de la Baume, not to walk in his footsteps, but to defend the franchises of Geneva. He saw in the sufferings he was enduring the punishment of his misdeeds. He implored forgiveness and hoped God would pardon him in purgatory. But Charles III, Duke of Savoy and Piedmont, still lived, and unwarned by the miserable end of his accomplice, he continued to prosecute his guilty project. Another martyr of liberty was now to offer up his life. The man who most embarrassed the Duke still lived. He must be swept from his path. Charles did not believe in patriotism, and thought to buy Leverrier. The judge spurned the bribe. Well, the axe will do what gold cannot. He was arrested, Easter 1524, at the gates of St. Pierre, as he was leaving after hearing morning mass. He wore a long camlet robe, probably his judicial gown, and a beautiful velvet cassock. Mounted hastily upon a wretched nag, his hands tied behind his back, and his feet fastened below the belly of the horse, the judge was carried in the midst of armed men, who jeered and called him a traitor, to the castle of Bonn, where the Duke was then residing. The castle of Bonn, now a ruin, it stands in the midst of scenery such as Switzerland can only show. The panorama presents to the eye an assemblage of valleys, with their carpet-like covering, foaming torrents, the black mouths of gorges, pines massed upon the hilltops, and beyond, afar off, the magnificence of snowy peaks. The tragedy enacted here we shall leave de Bigny to tell, who has there, with his usual graphic power, set in the light of day a deed that was done literally in the darkness. Shortly, says the historian, after Belgrade's, the man who pronounced doom, departure, the confessor entered, discharged his duty mechanically, uttered the sentence, ego te absolvo, and withdrew, showing no more sympathy for his victim than the provost had done. Then appeared a man with a cord. It was the executioner. It was then 10 o'clock at night. The inhabitants of the little town and the adjacent country were sleeping soundly, and not one dreamed of the cruel deed that was about to cut short the life of the man who might have appeared in the first rank of a great monarchy. The headsman bound the noble Leverrier. Armed men surrounded him, and the martyr of law was conducted slowly to the castle yard. All nature was dumb. Nothing broke the silence of that funeral procession. Charles's agents moved like shadows beneath the ancient walls of the castle. The moon, which had not reached its first quarter, was near setting, and shed only a feeble gleam. It was too dark to distinguish the beautiful mountains, in the midst of which stood the towers whence they had dragged their victim. The trees and houses of Bonn were scarcely visible. One or two torches, carried by the provost's men, alone threw light upon this cruel scene. On reaching the middle of the castle yard, the headsman stopped, and the victim also. The ducal satellites silently formed a circle round them, and the executioner prepared to discharge his office. Leverrier was calm. The peace of a good conscience supported him in this dread hour. Alone in the night, in those sublime regions of the Alps, surrounded by the barbarous figures of the Savoyard mercenaries, standing in that feudal court, which the torches illuminated with a sinister glare, the heroic champion of the law raised his eyes to heaven, and said, "By God's grace, I die without anxiety for the liberty of my country and the authority of St. Peter." The grace of God, liberty, authority, these main principles of the greatness of nations, were his last confession. The words had hardly been uttered when the executioner swung round his sword, and the head of the citizen rolled in the castle yard. Immediately, as if struck with fear, the murderers respectfully gathered up his remains and placed them in a coffin, and his body was laid in the earth in the parish church of Bonn. At that moment the moon set. The black darkness hid the stains of blood which Leverrier had left on the courtyard.